On a cold, late November day in 1941, a lieutenant colonel named Andrew Bruce sat alone in his Fort Meade office in Maryland, surrounded by classified photographs and intelligence reports that detailed something the American military establishment simply refused to believe was happening. The images showed German armoured columns tearing through France with a speed and efficiency that made every assumption about tank warfare look like dangerous fantasy. Bruce kept a personal journal, and his handwritten notes from that period, later found buried in the National Archives decades after the war, reveal a man watching his country's entire military doctrine crumble before his eyes. The Americans had prepared themselves to fight a war that no longer existed, while the Germans had written an entirely new rulebook for mechanized combat. The anti-tank guns that the United States Army relied upon were little more than stationary targets waiting to be destroyed. What was needed, Bruce understood with growing urgency, was something mobile, something capable of hunting enemy armor rather than simply sitting still and hoping to survive. Looking through his window, Bruce watched training exercises involving the M3 gun motor carriage, which was essentially a desperate improvisation consisting of a 75mm gun bolted awkwardly onto a half-track chassis. Every officer who saw these vehicles understood they represented nothing more than a temporary measure, something to fill the gap until a real solution could be found. The problem was that nobody had any idea what that solution might look like. The statistics coming from Europe painted a terrifying picture. Panzer divisions were achieving kill ratios of 10-1 against static defensive positions. The Wehrmacht's armoured spearheads had demolished the French army in just 6 weeks, crushed Poland in slightly over a month, and were now driving hundreds of miles into Soviet territory at speeds that defied everything military planners thought they understood about logistics and movement. Bruce had just taken command of something called the Tank Destroyer Tactical and Firing Center, a newly created organization that existed primarily because nobody else had any better ideas about how to counter German armor. In 10 days, Japanese aircraft would attack Pearl Harbor and drag America into a war it was catastrophically unprepared to fight. Nobody in the crowded emergency meetings that followed Pearl Harbor could have predicted that this quiet Texan from Missouri would oversee the development of what would become the most effective tank killer the American military ever produced. The initial reactions to the vehicle's specifications ranged from skepticism to outright dismissal. Virtually every armor officer who reviewed the design called it too radical, too fragile, too different from everything conventional wisdom said an armoured vehicle should be. The mathematics of armoured warfare were being calculated in blood across European battlefields, and the numbers told a brutal story. German Panther tanks weighed 45 tons, carried 80mm of frontal armour, and mounted high-velocity 75mm guns capable of destroying any American tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. The Tiger tank was even more formidable, weighing 56 tons with 100mm of frontal armour that made it essentially invulnerable to anything in the American arsenal. Against these steel monsters, the United States Army possessed exactly 0 vehicles capable of penetrating German armour at combat ranges with any reliability. The standard American anti-tank weapon, a 37mm gun, might as well have been firing rubber balls at concrete walls for all the good it did against German tanks. 6 months before Bruce found himself staring at those intelligence photographs, General George Marshall had cut through the bureaucratic paralysis by creating an anti-tank planning board with Bruce as its head, while Brigadier General Leslie McNair took immediate action on organizing anti-tank forces. McNair, who was brilliant tactically but would later die from American bombs falling on his position in Normandy, understood something fundamental about mobile armor that many of his colleagues refused to accept. Static defense against mobile armor was simply tactical suicide. His directive from early August laid the foundation for revolutionary thinking about how to counter tanks. Speed and aggressive action to search out and attack opposing tanks before they could form up for assault. But doctrine without actual weapons was just theory written on paper. What Bruce needed was something that violated every sacred principle of tank design that the army clung to. While the armoured force continued demanding heavily protected tanks for prolonged firefights, Bruce envisioned something completely different. A vehicle so fast it could outflank any tank on the battlefield, so agile it could strike from unexpected angles and disappear before enemy guns could even traverse to engage it, and carrying a gun powerful enough to kill any armour it encountered. Speed would replace armour as protection. Mobility would substitute for heavy steel plating. The concept was a rapier in a battlefield dominated by broadswords. The Louisiana maneuvers conducted in September 1941 provided the first real evidence that the concept might actually work. Despite using primitive equipment, including towed 37mm guns and surplus 75mm guns hastily mounted on half-tracks, the mobile anti-tank forces exceeded every expectation. Umpires ruled that the fast-moving tank destroyer units had successfully killed 91% of all attacking armour during the exercises. The success was so complete and so unexpected that officers from the armoured force actually complained the results must have been manipulated. On the 27th of November, Marshall ordered the establishment of the Tank Destroyer Centre under Bruce's command and authorised activation of 53 new anti-tank battalions. By April of the following year, the centre would relocate to a newly constructed facility called Camp Hood in Texas, where vast stretches of open terrain allowed proper training for the kind of mobile warfare Bruce envisioned. The early months of 1942 brought cascading failures that proved just how desperately new solutions were needed. The M6 gun motor carriage, which was basically a Dodge pickup truck with a 37mm gun mounted in the bed, proved absolutely worthless in North Africa. Crews reported that the recoil from firing the gun would literally flip the entire vehicle backward. The M3 half-track offered marginally better firepower, but provided absolutely zero protection for the exposed crews. German 88mm guns were destroying them at 3,000 yards, often before American crews even realized they were under fire. The M10 Wolverine, based on the Sherman chassis, showed more promise but remained too slow for the hit-and-run tactics Bruce knew were essential. By February 1942, American forces deployed to North Africa were learning brutal lessons about the reality of modern armoured warfare through direct and bloody experience. At a place called Kasserine Pass, German panzers destroyed 183 American tanks while losing only 20 of their own. American tank destroyer units, equipped with inadequate weapons and trained for the wrong kind of war, were simply annihilated. A captain named James Miller from the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion wrote a letter home that survived the war, describing how they felt like they were fighting tigers with slingshots. American shells bounced off German armour like raindrops. The Germans were destroying American vehicles at ranges where American guns couldn't even scratch their paint. It was in this atmosphere of crisis and repeated defeat that an unlikely partnership began to form. The Buick Motor Division of General Motors, which had spent decades producing luxury automobiles for America's wealthiest citizens, was about to design the vehicle that would restore American armoured superiority on the battlefield. The vehicle that would become the M18 originated in the design studio of a man named Harley Earl, who worked for Buick Motor Division. Earl, who would later become legendary for creating the Corvette and essentially inventing the entire concept of automotive styling as a discipline, brought a radically different perspective to military vehicle design. On a foggy morning in April 1942, Earl gathered his team of civilian designers in a Detroit conference room. The people surrounding him weren't military officers, but automotive stylists who had spent their entire careers making cars beautiful rather than lethal. The initial army requirement seemed completely impossible to fulfill. They needed to design a vehicle weighing under 20 tons that could reach 50 miles per hour, mount a gun capable of destroying any German tank, and be mass-produced using automotive manufacturing techniques rather than traditional tank construction methods. Army tank designers had already declared flatly that it couldn't be done. Earl's team, unburdened by decades of military orthodoxy, saw possibilities where others insisted impossibility reigned. The first sketches, which are still preserved in the General Motors Heritage Centre, reveal a vehicle that looked more like a sports car than anything resembling a tank. Low and sleek, with a raked hull and open turret to save weight. Where traditional tanks were tall and imposing structures designed to inspire fear, Earl's design hugged the ground. Where tanks were essentially heavily armoured boxes, his vehicle used sloped surfaces designed to deflect impacts rather than absorb them through sheer thickness. Every line and angle was optimized for speed rather than protection. Earl's staff even designed what would become the iconic logo, a wildcat biting down on crushed tank treads accompanied by the motto that would become the rallying cry of tank destroyer forces everywhere: seek, strike, destroy. Buick engineers initially thought the designers had completely lost their minds. The armour specification called for a maximum thickness of just 1 inch, less than half what German tanks carried. The chief engineer, a man named Robert McCurry, reportedly threw the specifications across the conference table and declared that what they were looking at wasn't a tank destroyer, but a death trap on tracks. But Charles Chain, who was Buick's vice president of engineering, recognised something that others were missing. If the vehicle could be made fast enough, truly fast enough in ways no tank had ever been before, it wouldn't need thick armour, because it would never be in the same place when enemy shells arrived. Through the blazing heat of summer 1942, Buick engineers performed what military historians would later describe as miracles of innovation under impossible time pressure. They developed a torsion bar suspension system that provided stability at unprecedented speeds, technology that had never been successfully implemented in an American combat vehicle before. The system was adapted from European designs but refined using Buick's extensive automotive expertise in ways that allowed the vehicle to maintain stability at speeds that would have literally shaken conventional tanks to pieces. They created something called the Torque-matic automatic transmission, revolutionary because it could handle massive torque loads while providing smooth acceleration that tank drivers had never experienced. Every single component was engineered for speed and reliability rather than brute strength and heavy weight. The power plant selection proved even more radical than the suspension or transmission. They chose the Wright R975, a 9-cylinder radial aircraft engine that produced 400 horsepower. The same engine powered B-24 Liberator bombers flying missions over Europe. Installing an aircraft engine in a ground vehicle required completely reimagining cooling systems, airflow dynamics, and maintenance procedures. Buick engineers created an engine compartment that could be accessed from above, with the entire engine sliding out on rails for field replacement in under 4 hours, faster than changing a transmission in a civilian truck. The design evolution moved at wartime speed, compressed timeframes that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. The T-42, with its inadequate 37mm gun, was abandoned before completion. The T-49 mounted a 57mm gun, better than the 37 but still insufficient against German heavy armour. The T-67 carried the 75mm gun used on Sherman tanks, but testing revealed a need for even more penetrating power. Finally, the T-70 emerged carrying the new 76mm gun, a weapon capable of penetrating German armour at realistic combat ranges. January 1943 brought what could be called the moment of truth. The Ordnance Department directed that 6 pilot models of the 76mm gun motor carriage designated T-70 be built, incorporating torsion bar suspensions, more powerful engines, new turret designs, and refined hull configurations. The prototype that rolled out of Buick's massive Flint, Michigan factory that spring defied every expectation and shattered every assumption about what a combat vehicle could actually achieve. At 18 tons total weight, it weighed less than half of a German Panther tank. Its sloped armour, though thin by conventional standards, presented difficult angles for enemy shells to penetrate effectively. The open-topped turret design was controversial but absolutely necessary for keeping weight down, and it provided unprecedented visibility for crews trying to spot targets. But it was the performance that left observers literally speechless when they first witnessed it. The vehicle that would become known as the Hellcat achieved 55 miles per hour consistently during testing, with some runs reaching 60 miles per hour on paved roads. To comprehend just how extraordinary this achievement was, consider that the German Panther tank, which was considered fast for its size and weight class, managed 28 miles per hour on roads under ideal conditions. The feared Tiger tank struggled to reach 23 miles per hour even on flat terrain. The American Sherman, which was the backbone of Allied armoured forces throughout the war, topped out at 25 miles per hour. The T-70 could literally run circles around any tank on the battlefield. At the General Motors Milford Proving Ground, the same facility where Buick normally tested luxury sedans for wealthy customers, the T-70 underwent trials that seemed more appropriate for a race car than a weapon of war. Top-speed testing occurred on a paved, banked oval track normally used for civilian vehicles. Ride quality tests involved specially developed stretches of artificial terrain with bumps and obstacles that would have destroyed conventional suspensions. The vehicle demonstrated ability to ford 6 feet of water, climb walls that stopped conventional tanks, and ram through structures that would trap heavier vehicles. The T-70 could accelerate from 0 to 30 miles per hour in under 15 seconds, faster than most civilian automobiles of that era. During one demonstration staged specifically for skeptical army brass who didn't believe the performance reports, a test driver deliberately launched the vehicle off a ramp at 35 miles per hour. The T-70 flew through the air, landed hard on the other side, and continued driving without any pause whatsoever. General Jacob Devers, who was observing this particular demonstration, reportedly turned to his aide and said that if the crew had survived that landing, they had just won the war. The 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion became the first unit to test this revolutionary vehicle under field conditions. The unit had been training on the completely inadequate M3 gun motor carriage and approached the T-70 with deep skepticism born from experience with failed equipment. Despite the prototypes requiring numerous improvements and modifications, the 704th compiled a superlative testing record that would significantly influence the vehicle's final configuration for production. Crews gradually discovered they weren't driving a tank in any conventional sense. They were operating something entirely new that required complete reimagining of armoured tactics and battlefield behaviour. They developed what became known as the shoot and scoot technique, firing 2 or 3 rounds from carefully concealed positions, then immediately relocating before enemy guns could even traverse to engage their position. They learned to use terrain features that conventional tanks couldn't traverse, racing through valleys and defiles where heavier vehicles would become bogged down or stuck. They discovered that at high speed, the T-70 presented an almost impossible target for even veteran German gunners who had never faced such a fast-moving threat before. A lieutenant named Edwin Leiper, who would later become one of the most successful tank destroyer commanders in the entire European theatre, wrote a letter to his wife during this training period describing how they were learning to fight like Apache warriors rather than conventional soldiers. Hit the enemy where they don't expect from angles they can't defend, then vanish like smoke before they can respond. The vehicle was so fast it felt like having a time machine. They were gone before enemy shells arrived where they had been moments before. The Tank Destroyer Board officially adopted the T-70 as a priority project on the last day of December 1942. Between that date and late November 1943, the board conducted exhaustive testing programs, eventually making 16 complete reports that recommended 137 specific modifications and improvements. Every single change was tested at both the Milford facility and Aberdeen Proving Grounds, with Buick engineers working directly alongside military crews to refine the design based on actual field experience. The turret traverse mechanism was accelerated. Gun stabilization was improved significantly. Radio equipment was repositioned for better protection from enemy fire. Storage compartments were added for ammunition and crew equipment. July 1943 marked the beginning of mass production at Buick's sprawling Flint plant. The factory that had produced luxury automobiles for bank presidents and Hollywood stars was now assembling tank destroyers at a unit cost of $55,230 per vehicle, approximately $750,000 in modern currency accounting for inflation. The production line, which had been modified in just 4 months from civilian automobile production to military vehicle assembly, incorporated revolutionary techniques from automotive manufacturing that had never before been applied to armoured vehicle construction. By January 1944, Buick was producing 100 Hellcats every single month. By spring, production had ramped up to 200 units monthly. Each individual vehicle required 20,000 separate parts sourced from suppliers located across 17 different states in a logistical coordination effort of extraordinary complexity. The War Department officially standardized the vehicle on February 18, 1944, designating it as the 76mm gun motor carriage M18. The designation came just as the first production vehicles were being loaded onto Liberty ships bound for European battlefields, where they would face their ultimate test against German armour. The first real combat test came in May 1944 in Italy. 5 T-70 prototypes were sent to the Anzio beachhead for battlefield evaluation with the 601st and 894th Tank Destroyer Battalions. The results exceeded even Bruce's most optimistic projections about what the vehicle could accomplish. In their very first engagement, 2 Hellcats destroyed 5 German tanks in just 12 minutes without taking a single hit in return. The after-action report, which remained classified for 30 years after the war, recorded the engagement in clinical detail. The Hellcats had used their superior speed to flank a column of Mark IV tanks, destroyed both the lead vehicle and trailing vehicle to trap the entire column in place, then systematically eliminated the remaining tanks from enfilade positions where the German crews couldn't effectively return fire. The German tanks never successfully engaged the Hellcats because their turrets couldn't traverse fast enough to track the speeding American vehicles. But it was in France that the Hellcat would truly earn its fearsome reputation across the entire German army. September 19, 1944, near a small village called Aracourt, would become the Hellcat's defining moment in military history and prove the validity of everything Bruce had envisioned years earlier. The German army had assembled its last major armoured reserve in the West, specifically the 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades, equipped with factory-fresh Panther tanks straight from production facilities. Berlin's leadership had personally ordered the destruction of Patton's Third Army, convinced that concentrated armour could drive American forces back across the Moselle River and potentially reverse the tide of the entire campaign. The morning of September 19th dawned with thick fog blanketing the French countryside, reducing visibility to less than 30 yards in some areas. Lieutenant Edwin Leiper led a single M18 platoon from C Company of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion toward a place called Réchicourt-la-Petite. Through the dense fog, a German tank gun muzzle suddenly appeared just 30 feet away from the lead Hellcat. In the next 5 minutes, military history was written in fire and steel. 5 German tanks from the 113th Panzer Brigade were knocked out completely for the loss of just one M18. The platoon continued their devastating work throughout the morning, destroying 10 more German tanks while losing another 2 Hellcats in the process. One M18, commanded by a sergeant named Henry Hartmann, knocked out 6 Panthers single-handedly through a combination of speed, positioning, and accurate gunnery. Hartmann's Hellcat raced between firing positions at speeds approaching 45 miles per hour, appearing to German observers as multiple vehicles attacking from different directions simultaneously. Panther crews reported being engaged by what they thought was an entire company of tank destroyers when they were actually facing just 4 Hellcats using their speed to create the illusion of superior numbers. By the time the Battle of Aracourt finally ended 11 days later, the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion had knocked out 39 German tanks for the loss of just 7 M18s, a kill ratio that absolutely stunned military analysts reviewing the engagement. More significant than the raw numbers was the psychological impact on German tank crews who had grown accustomed to dominating battlefields through technical superiority. They suddenly found themselves being hunted by an enemy they couldn't catch if they tried to pursue, and couldn't escape if they tried to retreat. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 provided the ultimate test of the Hellcat's capabilities under the worst possible combat conditions imaginable. On December 19th and 20th, a battalion-sized task force called Team Desaubry, defending the town of Noville, was supported by just 4 M18s from the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion. In brutal winter combat conditions, these 4 Hellcats destroyed 30 German tanks and inflicted between 500 and 1,000 casualties on the elite 2nd Panzer Division. The Noville engagement demonstrated the Hellcat's extraordinary strategic mobility in ways that shocked even advocates of the vehicle. Racing at speeds exceeding 50 miles per hour on icy roads, a feat that would terrify most drivers in civilian vehicles under normal conditions, the Hellcats covered 60 miles in under 2 hours, arriving at blocking positions 20 minutes before German reconnaissance units even knew American forces were moving into the area. Early combat feedback from units across multiple theatres revealed remarkable mechanical reliability that contradicted predictions about the vehicle's fragility. Crews consistently reported that Hellcats operated for hundreds of miles under harsh combat conditions without requiring major repairs to either armament or engines. The average Hellcat remained operationally ready 94% of the time, compared to 78% for Sherman tanks and 81% for M47s for M10 tank destroyers. This exceptional reliability came directly from Buick's automotive engineering philosophy that prioritized simplicity and ease of maintenance. Build it simple, build it strong, make it easy to fix in the field with basic tools. But the extraordinary success came at a terrible price that cannot be ignored or minimized. The open-topped turret design that saved precious weight exposed crews to snipers, artillery fragments, and weather conditions. The thin armor that provided unprecedented speed made Hellcats vulnerable to virtually any anti-tank weapon in existence. Testing revealed that 9 out of 30 armor-piercing 30-caliber bullets could penetrate the turret sides at just 75 yards. A German Panzerfaust could destroy a Hellcat at 100 meters. Even heavy machine guns posed legitimate threats at close range. Yet despite all these very real vulnerabilities, the Hellcat achieved something truly remarkable through its deployment. It restored American armored superiority through radical innovation rather than simple imitation of enemy designs. While British and Soviet forces responded to German heavy tanks by building their own heavy tanks in an arms race of increasing weight and armor thickness, America built something entirely different based on completely different principles. The M18 compiled the highest kill-to-loss ratio of any American tank or tank destroyer deployed during the entire Second World War. Total confirmed kills were 526 enemy vehicles, with 498 in the European theatre, 17 in Italy, and 11 in Pacific operations. The overall kill-to-loss ratio worked out to 2.4 to 1. The tank destroyer force had initially planned to build 8,986 Hellcats to equip all planned units, but production actually ceased at just 2,507 vehicles in October 1944. The reduced production wasn't due to any failure or problem with the vehicle itself, but rather the changing nature of the war in Europe. By late 1944, German armour was increasingly rare on battlefields, either destroyed in combat or abandoned due to lack of fuel to operate them. Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Bruce, observing Hellcat training exercises at Camp Hood in August 1944, told his assembled staff that they had asked American industry to do something that seemed completely impossible. Build a vehicle that could outrun, outmaneuver, and outfight the best tanks in the entire world while weighing half as much as those tanks. American industry didn't just meet that impossible requirement. They exceeded it in ways nobody had imagined possible at the beginning of the program. The impact of the Hellcat extended far beyond simple battlefield statistics and kill ratios. A German tank designer named Wilhelm Müller, who held the rank of Oberst and was captured late in the war, told American interrogators in 1945 something that revealed how differently the two industrial approaches functioned. The Germans could not understand how Americans built combat vehicles the same way they built automobiles. Every Hellcat that German forces examined and captured was essentially identical to every other one, with parts that were perfectly interchangeable and systems that were completely standardized. Germans built each Panther like a custom watch, taking weeks for each individual vehicle with slight variations. Americans built Hellcats like Ford builds cars, completing one vehicle every few hours with assembly line techniques. Germans could build better individual tanks with superior engineering. Americans could build more tanks faster, and that fundamental difference determined victory in the industrial war. The human dimension of the Hellcat story often gets completely overlooked in technical discussions focused on specifications and performance numbers. The crews who actually fought in Hellcats were predominantly young men from automotive backgrounds, mechanics and hot rodders, who understood engines and speed instinctively. They brought uniquely American approaches to armoured warfare, treating their Hellcats more like racing cars than conventional tanks. A sergeant named Michael O'Brien from the 603rd Tank Destroyer Battalion painted flame decals on his Hellcat's hull and even installed a horn that played Dixie when activated. His crew welded extra storage for personal equipment, modified seats for additional comfort, and illegally modified the engine governor to achieve even higher speeds than specifications allowed. O'Brien explained years later that they weren't conventional tankers in any traditional sense. They were hot rodders who just happened to be fighting a war against German armour. The post-war influence of the Hellcat on armoured vehicle design around the world cannot possibly be overstated. Every modern cavalry vehicle designed since 1945 owes some conceptual debt to the example the Hellcat established. The German Bundeswehr's Kanonenjagdpanzer directly copied the Hellcat's underlying philosophy of speed over protection. The French AMX-10RC adopted very similar design principles. Modern wheeled tank destroyers like the Italian Centauro trace their conceptual lineage directly back to the M18 and the doctrine it proved on battlefields across Europe. Lieutenant General William Dupuy, reflecting on the Hellcat's long-term influence in a 1978 paper, wrote that the M18 proved conclusively that victory doesn't always go to the biggest or strongest force. Victory goes to the smartest, fastest, and most innovative force that can adapt doctrine to technology. Every modern cavalry vehicle designed anywhere in the world owes something fundamental to the Hellcat's example of choosing speed over armour and mobility over static protection. The industrial story behind the Hellcat deserves recognition equal to the combat achievements. The same factory that was revolutionizing tank destroyer production was simultaneously manufacturing aircraft engines, ammunition cases, and countless other war materials. Buick had initially planned on producing 500 B-24 bomber engines monthly. By 1944, they were producing 2,000 engines monthly. The initial target for aluminum cylinder heads was 25,000 per month. They achieved 125,000 monthly, completely demolishing original expectations through process improvements and workforce expansion. A woman named Mary Patterson, one of thousands of women who built Hellcats at Buick's Flint plant during the war, recalled in an interview conducted in 1995 that she had gone from being a housewife to welding armor plate in just 3 weeks of intensive training. The training program was intense but deliberately simplified. Engineers had broken every complex task down into basic steps that anyone could learn regardless of previous experience. She personally welded hulls for probably 200 Hellcats during her time at the plant. Every time a Hellcat came back from Europe with victory markings painted on the hull, she wondered if it might have been one that she had built. The psychological impact on German forces was devastating and long-lasting in ways that extended beyond simple tactical considerations. Wehrmacht records captured after the war reveal growing dread of Hellcat units among frontline tank crews. German tank crews who had grown accustomed to technical superiority throughout most of the war found themselves being hunted by an enemy they couldn't catch or corner, no matter what tactics they employed. A major named Hans Richter, who served as intelligence officer for the 116th Panzer Division, wrote in January 1945 that the American Hellcat had created something approaching paranoia among German tank crews across the entire division. Crews were reporting being engaged by vehicles moving at what seemed like impossible speeds. Tank commanders were refusing to advance without extensive reconnaissance support, fearing Hellcat ambushes around every corner and hill. The psychological impact was exceeding the actual tactical threat, but the fear itself was paralyzing offensive operations. Of approximately 10,000 men who served in Hellcat units throughout the war, over 1,500 were killed in action. The casualty rate actually exceeded that of regular armoured units, reflecting the risks inherent in the light armour and aggressive tactics. A sergeant first class named Robert Mitchell, who survived having 3 different Hellcats destroyed under him during combat operations, reflected in an interview conducted in 1990 that everyone knew they were essentially rolling coffins if they got hit by enemy fire. But they also knew they could kill any tank on the battlefield if they were smart and fast enough. It was a devil's bargain in the truest sense. Trade protection for killing power and mobility. Most crews thought it was absolutely worth the risk. The story reaches its emotional culmination on May 8, 1945, which was VE Day, marking victory in Europe. In the town square of Pilsen, Czechoslovakia, a battered Hellcat from the 761 Tank Battalion sits surrounded by celebrating civilians who have just been liberated from years of occupation. The vehicle bears the visible scars of countless engagements, its thin armour pocked with shrapnel damage, tracks worn from thousands of miles of continuous warfare, but it survived to see victory. On the hull, the crew has carefully painted their combat score showing 31 enemy vehicles destroyed during their advance across Europe. A sergeant named James Washington, who had commanded that particular Hellcat throughout the campaign, returned to Pilsen in 1995 for the 50th anniversary of the city's liberation. Standing before a memorial dedicated to the 761st, he said that the Hellcat was America rendered in steel. Quick, clever and absolutely deadly when cornered or threatened. It wasn't a perfect vehicle by any measure, but it was perfectly American in conception and execution. They had taken what seemed like a crazy idea, essentially a tissue paper tank that could outrun anything on the battlefield, and made it work through sheer determination and industrial muscle that nobody could match. In just 15 months of actual production, Buick built 2,507 Hellcats from start to finish. Each individual vehicle contained 20,000 separate parts sourced from 186 primary suppliers and over 1,000 secondary suppliers spread across 38 different states. The production line operated 3 full shifts 24 hours daily and never stopped except for Christmas Day in 1943. At the peak of production in January 1944, a completed Hellcat rolled off the assembly line every 3.2 hours around the clock. William Knudsen, the former president of General Motors, who had been brought in to coordinate American war production, testified before Congress in 1946 about what the Hellcat program had demonstrated. The program showed American industry operating at its absolute peak capability. They had taken an impossible requirement to build a tank destroyer that weighs almost nothing, costs relatively little, and can destroy anything it encounters, and delivered a vehicle that exceeded every single specification. It wasn't just manufacturing in a conventional sense. It was closer to industrial alchemy. The philosophical implications of the Hellcat challenged military thinking worldwide and continue influencing doctrine even today. Traditional military doctrine had always emphasized mass, concentrated firepower, and maximum protection through thick armor. The Hellcat proved conclusively that speed, agility, and precision could overcome brute force if properly employed. General Don Starry, who was the principal architect of airland battle doctrine, wrote that the Hellcat proved that technical overmatch doesn't necessarily require superior weight or thicker armor plating. It requires superior thinking, superior tactics developed for specific capabilities, and the courage to accept calculated risk in exchange for decisive advantage. Every modern operational plan that emphasizes speed and maneuver over mass and protection owes some intellectual debt to those tank destroyer crews who proved the concept under fire. Even former enemies acknowledged the revolutionary impact years after the war ended. General Heinz Guderian, considered the father of German armored warfare doctrine, wrote in his memoirs that the American M18 represented a philosophy Germany should have adopted instead of their actual path. Instead of building increasingly heavier and more complex tanks that stressed logistics and industrial capacity to breaking points, Germany should have built faster, simpler vehicles in far greater numbers. The Hellcat proved that tactical mobility beats armor protection every time if properly employed by trained crews. Of the 2,507 Hellcats built during the war, fewer than 200 survive today in museums and private collections scattered around the world. Each restoration requires absolutely painstaking effort to source parts that haven't been manufactured for 70 years. A collector named Jacques Littlefield, who owned what was the world's largest private collection of armored vehicles until his death, spent over $400,000 restoring a single Hellcat to perfect running condition. He explained that the Hellcat represented everything right about American engineering philosophy: bold, innovative, effective, and practical. Every rivet and every weld in the vehicle tells the story of workers who quite literally built freedom's arsenal one vehicle at a time. At the final national reunion of Hellcat veterans held in 2015, a 93-year-old former staff sergeant named Vincent Romano, one of the very last living Hellcat commanders from the war, gave the closing speech to assembled veterans and their families. They had been kids driving hot rods in a war dominated by giants and heavy armor. Their Hellcats were tissue paper compared to German Tigers and Panthers in terms of armor protection, but they had speed, they had courage, and most importantly, they had each other. They proved that American kids in American-built machines could beat anyone, anywhere, anytime they met on the battlefield. Not because Americans were inherently stronger, but because they were smarter, faster, and more innovative in their tactical approach. The role of women in Hellcat production deserves special recognition that it rarely receives in military histories. Over 40% of the entire workforce building Hellcats were women performing jobs that had been reserved exclusively for men throughout the entire history of heavy industry. A woman named Rose Thompson, who supervised an all-female welding team at the Flint plant, recalled that they were told repeatedly that women couldn't build tanks or heavy armored vehicles. They went ahead and built the fastest, most effective tank destroyer deployed in the entire war. After that experience, nobody could ever tell them again what women couldn't accomplish. The Hellcat didn't just help defeat German tanks on European battlefields. It helped defeat prejudice and discrimination back home in American factories. General Omar Bradley, in his autobiography published years after the war, captured the essential nature of what the Hellcat represented. The Hellcat was quintessentially American in every possible way. Unconventional in design, innovative in approach, and devastatingly effective in actual combat. It represented the American approach to warfare perfectly. Americans didn't try to simply match the enemy's strengths directly. They tried to make enemy strengths completely irrelevant through different thinking. The M18 made heavy tanks obsolete not by being heavier than German tanks, but by being dramatically smarter in conception and employment. In 1973, Andrew Bruce was 79 years old and long retired from military service when he visited the Patton Museum at Fort Knox. Standing before a carefully restored M18 Hellcat on display, he spoke to a gathered group of young armor officers about the lessons the vehicle still taught. Everyone had told them it absolutely couldn't work as designed. Too light, too thin, too dependent on speed for protection. The armor board said it would be a death trap for crews. The Ordnance Department said it was technically impossible to build with available technology. The tactics they proposed for employment violated every established principle of armoured warfare doctrine, but they built it anyway despite all the opposition, and it worked beyond anyone's wildest dreams or expectations. The lesson isn't really about tanks or specific tactics for employment. The lesson is about having the courage to challenge conventional wisdom when conventional wisdom is demonstrably failing to solve the problem. The M18 Hellcat stands today as one of the most remarkable achievements in the entire history of military vehicle development. From the panicked recognition of American unpreparedness in 1941 to the victory celebrations sweeping across Europe in 1945, it travelled a developmental path that seemed completely impossible at the beginning. Born from the humiliating defeat at Kasserine Pass, designed in deliberate defiance of military convention and established doctrine, built by an awakened industrial giant that had been dormant and proven repeatedly in the crucible of combat from the beaches of Anzio all the way to the Rhine River crossings, the Hellcat demonstrated that innovation could overcome virtually any disadvantage. Today, in museums scattered around the world, surviving Hellcats stand silent with their engines cold and their guns empty of ammunition. But they still speak to anyone willing to listen to their message. They tell the story of American workers who built the arsenal of democracy one vehicle at a time through long shifts and hard work. They speak of young men who fought with extraordinary courage despite inadequate armor protection, knowing that speed was their only real protection against enemy fire. They speak of engineers who chose innovation over imitation when conventional thinking meant certain defeat on the battlefield. They speak of an entire nation that turned its massive industrial might into decisive military victory through sheer determination and creative genius that couldn't be matched. The rejected design that virtually nobody wanted at the beginning became the most successful tank destroyer in American military history. The vehicle that was dismissed as too light, too fast, and too unconventional proved that sometimes the best solution is the one that nobody expects or even considers possible. In the speed of the Hellcat was written the entire future of armoured warfare for generations to come. In its combat, success was proven the tremendous power of American innovation when unleashed and properly supported. And in its story lies a lesson that remains valid for all time, regardless of the specific challenge being faced. When facing a superior enemy with advantages in specific areas, don't waste effort trying to match their strengths directly in an arms race you cannot win. Instead, render their strengths completely irrelevant through superior thinking, superior speed of action, and the courage to do what nobody believes is actually possible. The M18 Hellcat was, in every possible sense, the weapon that won through pure speed rather than heavy armour, the tank destroyer that fundamentally redefined what was actually possible in armoured vehicle design, and the rejected design that saved countless Allied lives through the elegantly simple expedient of being somewhere else when enemy shells arrived where it had been moments before. It remains today, 80 years after its initial conception in a Detroit design studio, a lasting testament to American ingenuity, industrial might that could not be matched, and the tremendous power of thinking differently when different thinking is the only possible path to victory on the battlefield,